The tide of battle against the Luftwaffe may be likened to the flood and ebb of the ocean's waters on the sands of a wide beach. In the years of aggression, German fighters and fighter bombers came boldly forward, spreading out to the edges of the continent, some of them based on the very noses of the hated English, at places like Street Omer and Abbeville, within sight of the cliffs of Dover. It took a long time for the tide to turn, and for 3 years at the peak, there was stubborn suspension, the Jerrys clinging to what they had but unable to move any farther. Then, as the offensive might of the RAF and the 8th swelled to more than the Luftwaffe, who could resist? The great wave of conquest broke and receded. It receded steadily from then on, leaving high and dry the flotsam and jetsam of Nazi dreams. The 65th Fighter Wing, first American control headquarters to operate in the ETO, arrived at Saffron Walden, Essex at the time, when this German tide was just at the flood, June 1943. It had already been agreed between the Air Ministry and the 8th Fighter Command that the Americans should be given one of 11 Group's precious first-line operations room, the Debden sector located in the Saffron Walden Grammar School, 43 miles northeast of London. This was possible because RAF Fighter Command already sensed the frustration of the Luftwaffe and knew that the responsibility for controlling the defense of London could now be safely placed in fewer hands. Adjoining sectors were to be expanded to cover the gap. There were already 3 American fighter groups in operation in England: the 4th, the old Eagle Squadrons at Debden, the 78th at Duxford, and the 56th at Horsham St. Faith. They were all flying Thunderbolts, and their principal missions were fighter sweeps, fast nips in and out of the enemy coast at 30,000 feet and up, plus some preliminary short-range bomber escort work. These groups have been going on missions since April, testing their mettle against the Jerrys and finding the enemy tough and aggressive. In fact, the wily Hun had given some of the boys a pretty rough time when the Thunderbolts first stuck their stop noses in over the continental coastline, and both sides' air now had drawn first blood. On these missions, the fighters were being controlled by the RAF Debden sector staff. This arrangement provided an element of continuity, which permitted the Americans to make rapid headway right from the start. Here was a place to work. Here were communications and people to act as tutors and interpreters to the British way of doing things. Some 60 of the key ops room people of the RAF stayed on for a month or more with Americans to help out. There was not, in fact, too much interpreting to do, because prior to this time the American and British Air Forces had agreed on a standard code of procedure in the control of aircraft. This had been taught at the Controller School at Orlando, and the Americans found themselves on reasonably familiar ground. Already on the scene when the 65th Fighter Wing arrived, where the 52nd Fighter Control Squadron, and then 327th Signal Company Wing, the former to man the control room and outlying fixture and radio stations, and the latter to provide and operate headquarters communications. In fact, the first American contribution to control of fighters in England was a 3-station fixture system established by the 52nd FCS on June 14, 1943, to listen out for maydays, distress calls, on the air/sea rescue frequency of the American fighter groups. The squadron had a triangulation room at Hornchurch Airdrome, taking bearings from stations at Palling, Leiston, and Tollerhunt Darcy. The fixtures were phoned through the Debden sector control room. During this period, the control personnel of the 52nd and later of the wing headquarters were sitting in under control of missions at Saffron, getting ready to take over in July. It was a significant moment when, at 8:30 July 1st, 1943, defensive responsibility was removed once and for all from Debden sector and assumed by North Weald. A night and day watch that had lasted without interruption from before Britain declared war on Germany suddenly ended. Tensions suddenly relaxed. For the men and women of the RAF, it was a holiday, but the Americans were too intent on the job ahead, to really appreciate how much this meant. To them, the old ops room was just a place to move into, a tool to be used in a war yet to be fought. True, they would say to one of the numerous visitors who beat a path to Saffron. Yes, in this ops room, part of the Battle of Britain was fought and won. But the memories of the exciting days of combat overhead, of the long nights when the drone of German bombers coincided with the appearance of hostile plots on the board, all these remained locked in the minds and hearts of those who had labored in the old brick buildings so long, and were now free for other tasks. The communications people and the carpenters swarmed into the office building at once to start work of conversion, no mean task in itself. But the biggest job of all lay outside the ops room, the establishment of 2 complete fixture nets and the necessary forward relay stations. How these operated will be discussed in detail in Chapter 4. In general, it was intended to provide pilots with fixing servers on both B and D channels and to get radio transmitters and receivers out on the shores of England as close as possible to the enemy for greater range. The first hastily established stations fringing the coastline were by no means a permanent arrangement, and in fact there was hardly a month in the whole 2 years of control that Saffron that did not see some change in the layout. But the first networks, as shown in the accompanying map, did work. And work well thanks to the night dash and day efforts of members of the 52nd Fighter Control Squadron and the careful planning of the Wing and 8 Fighter Command signal sections. By the time all these new wiring had been led into the ops room, and the room itself had been redesigned with 10 new group controllers' positions, old Debden control room had been through what might be termed as a first-class facelifting. The general plan was that the 65th Fighter Wing should provide all the American control at the beginning and serve as an orientation unit for other controls. That as more fighter groups arrived, the 66th and 67th Fighter Wings should assume part of the load with a permanent arrangement of 5 groups administered and controlled by each of the 3 wings. Before launching into the story of how this was carried out, a brief word of explanation may be needed of just the sort of units these wings were. Back in the States, starting about the 1st of 1943, the 1st and 4th Fighter Commands started building overseas units out of the air defense wings, which were then guarding the east and the west coasts. The first of these were ready to start for England by May 1943. From San Francisco, Colonel Jesse Otten brought the 4th Air Defense Wing, and from the Norfolk region, Colonel Murray Woodbury led the 5th Air Defense Wing. They made the transatlantic trip together, on the Queen Elizabeth arriving at Debden and Duxford, respectively June 4th, 1943. These units were later redesignated 65th and 66th Fighter Wings. The 67th Fighter Wing had a different background. It was built up in the ETO, using as a nucleus the old 6th Fighter Wing, an inadequate unit which had not been used. Colonel Ed Anderson of the 4th Fighter Group took command of the 67th on August 15th, 1943. On March 2nd, 1944, all 3 fighter wing commanders became brigadier generals. As the control scheme worked out, the 65th began controlling at Saffron Walden on July 4th, 1943. The others opened up later on. The general mission of a fighter wing in the USOF corresponds fairly closely with that of a group in the RAF Fighter Command. It includes administrative as well as operational responsibility, none of which will be touched on here except that bearing directly on the problem of control. A fighter wing is normally supplied with a fighter control squadron and a signal company, such as the ones mentioned earlier. Within the operations section of wing headquarters are 6 controllers, one of whom is designated as senior controller. It is contemplated in the tables of organization that all other control personnel will be furnished by the fighter control squadrons. This scheme was not strictly followed at Saffron Walden. At the beginning, the entire operations room was handled as a function of a three-wing headquarters, and it was not till later that there was a definite delineation of duties and a separation of the work off the fighter control squadron and the wing headquarters staff. At one time, there were as many as 20 wing headquarters officers doing duty in the control room, instead of the 6 specified in the tables. The reasons this came about are principally two. First, time was so short that it was natural to put the most adaptable man available into each job, regardless of his organization. Secondly, virtually all the mission planning was done at a higher level, i.e. fighter command, and control thus took the center of the stage as the chief operational function of the wing. Readers in other theaters must have sensed here now that there is nothing typical about the development of fighter control in the 8th. It couldn't have happened this way anywhere except in England. For where else in the world is there a gigantic concentration of air bases that has made it practicable to operate 2,000 bombers as a single force, or to operate 15 fighter groups day after day on a single daily field order? Where else the communications, the plethora of teletypes to permit efficient mission planning for such a great force at one high headquarters? In any other circumstances, and fighting wing staff could not have afforded to lavish the attention on control that it did here. It was far from a simple or routine task that the Americans began at Saffron on July 1st. There was no precedent whatsoever. No one in the USOF had ever before employed a strategic fighter escort force of this contemplated scale. True, the 4th, 56th, and 78th had been on a few joint missions in April, May, and June, but these were recognized as little more than indoctrination and familiarization flights. Ahead lay the forbidding vistas of a war since won. Yet in the unread future were the fierce and terrible battles of the bombers and their escorts over Hanover, Schweinfurt, Brunswick, and Leipzig. In the hands of these fighter pilots and their allied comrades laid the hopes of the free world for the defeat of the ascendant Luftwaffe. Every tiny detail of how that defeat was to be arranged had yet to be worked out through work and study, trial and error, and sometimes bitter experience. So, against that backdrop, the closed curtain of the future, fighter control set to work to put its part of the puzzle together, piece by piece.